Whiskey and brandy might sit on the same bar shelf, glowing amber under the lights, but they could not be telling more different stories. One starts its life as humble grain, brewed and distilled into something bold and fiery. The other begins as fruit, often grapes, transformed from wine into something smooth, aromatic, and layered. Yet when they're poured into a glass, most people just see brown liquor and call it a day. In this video, we're going to change that. Because once you understand what separates whiskey from brandy, from their ingredients to their history, from their flavors to their rituals, you'll never look at either drink the same way again. And who knows? By the end, you might even discover which one fits your personality, your taste, and your favorite moments a little better. First, let's strip it back to basics. What are these drinks really? Whiskey is a distilled spirit made from grains. Think barley, corn, rye, or wheat. Those grains are mashed, fermented into an alcohol-rich beer, then distilled and aged in wood, usually oak. That's where whiskey gets its deeper color and those familiar notes of vanilla, caramel, spice, or smoke. Brandy, on the other hand, is born from fruit. Most commonly, grapes, but also apples, pears, cherries, and beyond. You start with wine or fermented fruit juice, distill it, and often age it in barrels. The very word brandy comes from a Dutch term meaning burnt wine, a nod to its origins as distilled wine. So if you want the shortest possible summary, whiskey comes from grain, brandy comes from fruit. That one difference already sets them on completely different journeys in the glass. Now, let's take a quick walk through history, because these drinks didn't just appear in a cocktail bar one day. Whiskey's story likely begins in the misty lands of Ireland and Scotland, somewhere around the late Middle Ages. Monks were experimenting with distillation, originally for medicinal purposes, and someone eventually realized this water of life was not only potent, but surprisingly enjoyable. Over time, local farmers used whatever grain they had, barley in Scotland, mixed grains elsewhere, and styles like Scotch, Irish whiskey, bourbon, and rye slowly emerged as distinct traditions. When whiskey crossed the Atlantic, American distillers leaned heavily into corn and rye, giving us the sweeter profile of bourbon and the spicy punch of rye whiskey. Brandy's story unfolds further south in Europe, tied closely to winemaking regions. In the 15th and 16th centuries, traders and winemakers discovered that distilling wine made it more stable for storage and transport. What started as a practical solution quickly became a beloved drink in its own right. Regions like Cognac and Armagnac in France refined the art, turning brandy into a symbol of luxury and refinement. Other countries followed suit: Spanish brandies, Eastern European fruit brandies, and apple-based Calvados from Normandy. So while whiskey evolved out of beer-like brewing traditions, brandy grew from the world of winemaking and vineyards. Two very different cultural roots, both converging on the same idea: concentrate flavor, concentrate character. If we zoom in a bit more, the ingredients tell us even more about their personalities. With whiskey, the grain recipe, often called the mash bill, is everything. A bourbon has to be mostly corn, which is why it tends to taste sweeter and rounder. Rye whiskey leans on rye grain, bringing sharper, spicier notes. Scotch and many Irish whiskeys emphasize malted barley, giving a bready, nutty, sometimes smoky character. Even small changes in the proportions can shift the flavor dramatically. For whiskey, grains are like the script of a movie. They determine the tone long before the director steps in. In brandy's world, grapes take center stage, and not just any grapes. In regions like Cognac, specific grape varieties are grown almost exclusively for distillation. These wines might taste too sharp or acidic to sip casually, but they're perfect once they're distilled and aged. Outside grape-based brandy, you'll find apple brandy, plum brandy, or cherry-based spirits in many European traditions. Think of these as snapshots of local agriculture captured in a bottle. While whiskey's identity is tied to fields of grain, brandy's soul lives in orchards and vineyards. The fruit you start with, tart apple, floral grape, or rich plum, leaves a fingerprint that remains detectable even after years in a barrel. Now, let's talk about how these spirits are actually made once fermentation is done. Both whiskey and brandy go through distillation, but the priorities are different. Whiskey is often distilled in copper pot stills or tall column stills. Pot stills typically give a heavier, more flavorful spirit, full of grain character and congeners, those flavor compounds that make each batch unique. Column stills, commonly used in many American whiskeys, can create cleaner, higher-proof spirits, which are later shaped by barrel aging. The goal with whiskey isn't to strip out all the grain character. It's to refine it, concentrate it, and prepare it for a slow transformation inside wood. Brandy distillation, in many cases, is more about preserving the delicate aromas of fruit. Traditional cognac and armagnac are usually distilled in copper pot stills in a way that deliberately captures those floral, fruity notes. The distiller carefully chooses where to cut the run, deciding which parts to keep and which to discard, to keep the spirit expressive and aromatic rather than harsh. If whiskey is about taming and refining something robust, brandy is about protecting something fragile and turning it into a refined expression. Even at this stage, you can already sense the difference. Whiskey tends to feel more muscular, brandy more graceful. Then comes the part that many people romanticize the most: aging in barrels. Whiskey, especially styles like bourbon and many scotches, is deeply defined by the wood it rests in. Bourbon legally has to be aged in new, charred oak barrels. That intense contact with charred wood floods the spirit with notes of vanilla, caramel, toasted coconut, and smoke. Scotch, which often uses used barrels, previously filled with bourbon, sherry, or wine, picks up more subtle layers: dried fruit, nuttiness, gentle spice, or peat smoke, depending on the cask's history. For most whiskeys, aging isn't optional. It's what turns a sharp, raw distillate into something smooth and layered. Brandy also spends time in wood, but the approach is often more flexible, and the goal slightly different. Grape-based brandies like cognac often mature in French oak, gaining flavors of dried fruit, almond, spice, and soft tannins. But the fruity core is usually allowed to shine through more clearly than in many whiskeys. Some fruit brandies are aged only briefly, and others are bottled clear and unaged, especially when the goal is to highlight fresh fruit rather than woody complexity. Where whiskey often wears its barrel like heavy armor, brandy can feel like it's wearing a tailored suit. Wood is there, shaping and supporting, but not always dominating the conversation. So, what does all of this mean for your taste buds? Whiskey usually leans bold. Take a sip of a well-made whiskey and you might detect layers of caramel, brown sugar, baking spices, toasted oak, nuts, smoke, or even dark chocolate. Bourbon might give you sweet corn notes with vanilla and toffee. Rye might add peppery, spicy edges. Peated Scotch can taste like a campfire by the ocean. It's no wonder whiskey is often associated with ruggedness, depth, and a bit of drama. Brandy, meanwhile, tends to be softer around the edges, though no less complex. A good grape brandy can deliver aromas of dried apricot, fig, raisins, orange peel, floral notes, honey, and gentle spice. Some apple or pear brandies lean crisp and bright, while older ones become rich and pastry-like. If whiskey is the bold storyteller in a smoky bar, brandy is the elegant guest at a quiet after-dinner gathering, telling stories more softly, but with just as much detail. The cultures around these drinks reflect that difference. Whiskey has found its way into countless contexts: neat in a heavy glass, splashed over ice, or stirred into classic cocktails like the old-fashioned, Manhattan, or whiskey sour. It's equally at home at a backyard barbecue, a jazz bar, or a winter cabin. Whiskey tasting has become almost like wine tasting, with enthusiasts debating barrel finishes, regions, and age statements. Brandy's traditional home, by contrast, is often at the end of a meal. Picture a warm room, dim lighting, and a rounded snifter glass gently cradled in the hand, the warmth helping release aromatic waves from the spirit. Brandy is commonly seen as a digestive, something you sip slowly after dinner, maybe with dessert or a bit of chocolate. That said, brandy also appears in cocktails like the Sidecar, Brandy Alexander, or classic punches, where its fruit-forward nature plays beautifully with citrus, cream, and spices. While whiskey culture often centers around rugged individuality and craftsmanship, brandy culture leans toward elegance, hospitality, and the art of lingering a little longer at the table. Of course, there's also the question people quietly ask, but don't always say out loud: which one is better? The honest answer is that neither wins by default. It depends on what you value in a drink and in the moment you're in. If you enjoy bold, grain-driven flavors, a bit of spice, and the drama of smoky or heavily oaked notes, whiskey is likely to feel like home. If you prefer something smoother, fruit-led, and slightly more polished, brandy might be the better match. In a way, whiskey feels like exploring wild landscapes. Brandy feels like walking through an old, beautiful city at night. It's also worth remembering that both spirits are incredibly diverse within their categories. Not all whiskeys are fiery, and not all brandies are gentle. You'll find light, approachable whiskeys and rich, intense brandies. There are affordable blends made for simple enjoyment and rare bottles meant for special occasions. The fun lies in exploring, comparing, and noticing how your preferences evolve over time. And of course, whatever you explore, it should always be done responsibly and only if you're of legal drinking age where you live. So, when you see two amber glasses side by side, one whiskey, one brandy, you're not just looking at two drinks, you're looking at two different stories of human ingenuity. One born in fields of grain, the other in rows of vines. One shaped by the traditions of brewers and farmers, the other by winemakers and traders. One often charging forward with bold flavors, the other gliding in with subtle fruit and quiet elegance. They're not rivals so much as two different answers to the same question. How can we capture the character of our land, our crops, and our craft in a single glass? Thank you for joining us on this journey into the world of whiskey and brandy. If you've got ideas for other food or drink face-offs you'd like us to explore next, drop your suggestions in the comments below, and if we use your idea, we'll gladly give you a shout-out in a future video. If you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to check out our other bingeable channels and episodes, where we unpack the hidden stories behind the everyday things we take for granted. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell, so you don't miss the next story woven into the simplest details.